So, for those of you who are just joining us for the first time in a few weeks, first of all, word of welcome, welcome to worship, or welcome back to worship. We are in the midst of a 4-week sermon series, and this is week 4 of 4. And we have been talking about the topic of change. And obviously, change is something that we are all experiencing constantly, but perhaps more than our normal amount this year. 2020 has already seemed to bring a great deal of change to many of our lives. And so we've been talking so far in this series for the past few weeks about the kinds of change that we are likely to see on a regular basis. Change that comes at us rather quickly, maybe change that we didn't bargain for, change that we didn't necessarily want to happen, but change that has been forced upon us. And we've talked about how we can wrestle with that change, we can have God lead us through that change. We can look to Scripture for some guidance in that change. We can even choose change as opposed to change calling all of the shots in our lives. But today I want to speak to you about a different kind of change that I think we need to talk about if we're going to make sure that we talk about the different kinds of change that we are likely to experience in our lives. And that is the change of heart. So when you think about what a change of heart is, obviously that's a different kind of change than maybe, say, the change that a pandemic brings to our lives. Change of heart is something that feels a lot more personal to us. It may only impact us, or it may cause us to have to re-examine something perhaps, or wrestle through something, struggle with something that maybe is a part of who we are. It may be a part of our upbringing. It may be something that we have been taught and are moving in a different direction from. It may be a growing or evolving along the way. And so I would like you to take a moment now, and we're going to actually just kill all the audio here and just have a few moments of silence. And I would like you to think about a time that you experienced a change of heart. So think for a moment in this silence. When was a time that you experienced a change of heart? And go back there for a moment. Let's do that now. All right, well, hopefully that gave you a moment to think of something, and maybe if nothing came to mind in that moment, well, maybe something will as we continue on in the service. But one of the things that occurs to me about the change of heart, one of the things that makes that so challenging for us, is that usually it goes against something that has been deeply ingrained or deeply seated within us for a very long time. And then there are these inner voices within us that tell us that when we are considering a change of heart, or when we are shifting from one perspective to another, whether it be on a topic or an issue, or whether it's about a relationship that we have, whether it's about how we feel about someone and that's beginning to change, or whether we're becoming more open to something that we had been relatively closed off to in the past, or even whether it's something that is a matter of our own faith. One of the things that makes it's so difficult as we do have these inner voices, these tiny monologues within us that are telling us that if we do have a change of heart, that if we do shift our perspective, that if we do come to understand something differently than we have in the past, that what we are doing is selling out, or that we are on a slippery slope to ruin, or if it's a matter of faith, that maybe this thing is new to us and so therefore it's wrong, when maybe it's not wrong at all, or maybe we hear voices telling us that if this isn't what I was taught, then maybe this is heretical, but that doesn't feel quite right to us either. And so we have these inner mechanisms that seem to be working against us ever having a change of heart, because it pushes us into a new space, into an uncomfortable place in many cases, and something that feels altogether different. And that's what makes it feel like a risky kind of change. And yet my guess is, like we've talked about most every week in this series, if you were thinking of a change of heart that you have had, no matter how difficult it was to get from point A to where you are now, my guess is that you wouldn't go back and change to the old way of being if you were given the opportunity. Or if you could say, would erase all of that from my consciousness, would you do it? And I would venture to guess, at least, that the answer is most likely no. So how does a change of heart happen? I think that that's a question worth examining. And I'm not sure that there's a one-size-fits-all answers. But throughout the centuries, some things have been rather regarded as truisms throughout how one begins to change and have a change of heart. And this is something that I've been actually spending some time studying for the past year. And the way that I've been talking about it with some groups is really more about the word transformation. But for today's purposes, I want to talk about it as a change of heart. So if we think about what a change of heart has meant throughout the centuries, we go back to the ancient mystics in our Christian faith who look to three primary sources for where a change of heart comes from. And we find that they have taught that the origins are a change of heart comes from one of three places. The first is a place or experience of deep joy. Now, I hope that when you thought of a change of heart experience, that maybe one of the things that came to mind for you was a significant period of joy in your life, and it caused you to shift perspectives and have a change of heart. But I would venture to guess the second one is probably even more common for most of us, and that is the opposite of deep joy, which is a place of deep pain. So many of us have experienced a change of heart because of the pain that we have experienced in our own lives. And maybe that's what the case was for you, for the thing that you considered when you were asked to think of a place or a moment of change of heart. The last one is a place of contemplation. And so that you can use that word interchangeably with other words, I think, like a place of study or research or dialogue. But it's a mental exercise, right? You have this moment that something happens and you spend a great deal of time in prayer and contemplation and study and research. And over time, your perspective begins to shift and you have a change of heart. So deep joy, deep pain, and contemplation. These sort of tried and true, centuries, millennia old ways of experiencing a change of heart. But it occurs to me that there may be another way, and that is, I guess, what I would call relational, the relational way. Many of you considered a change of heart experience whose catalyst was really a relationship that you had, or that someone that you know and loved experienced a deep joy, a deep pain, or an intense period of contemplation, and because of your closeness to that person, you also experienced a change of heart. But it was a relational change of heart, or that was the impetus for it. That's certainly the case when I think about some of my most significant change of heart moments in my life. Yes, some of them were my own personal story or my own personal struggle, but more often than not, what happened was based on proximity to someone else that I know and love and care deeply for. They experienced something. And the cases that most frequently come to mind for me are those moments of deep pain. And seeing someone that I know and love suffer with something that is hurting them or hurting their heart so deeply has caused my heart to ache for them and want to do a period of contemplation, which leads to a gradual change in my perspective as well. And so maybe that's your story as well. And there are any number of things that you could probably think of when it comes to that. How do we feel about things like poverty? Or how do we feel about things like treating all people equally in the church or in society? How do we think about things like systemic racism, which we have all spent so much time considering and probably reading new books that we hadn't read before and entering into conversations that we wouldn't have had prior to this summer because of the events that have unfolded around our country and around our community. So these are some of the ideas that I'm talking about, where a shift in ways of thinking that led to a change of heart may not be something that impacted you personally, that you were the primary source for this, but based on your proximity to someone else, your heart was warmed or ached in that situation and led you on a path toward change and a change of heart eventually. So, to our scripture reading today. You heard just a few moments ago Dixie read the story that is probably most commonly associated with Good Friday. We heard the words of Jesus' final utterance on the cross. He's hanging there and he cries out in a loud voice, and the text comes to us in Aramaic but translates as to, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then we hear at this point that Jesus breathed his last and dies. But the part of the story that I want you to be paying attention to today is actually not that part. It's what happens immediately after that, where Mark, the gospel writer, turns his attention to the centurion. And the centurion says, remember these words, "Truly, this was God's son." Truly, this man was God's son. So, I haven't really spent much time with this, honestly, in the past, either in studying it or I don't believe I've ever preached on this text, but focused on the centurion. But that's where I want to go today. Because what I think has happened in this moment, if you do a little bit of pondering about the centurion, is that here we have an example of a man who, based on his proximity to someone going through deep pain, had a change of heart moment. Now, again, I realize that this may be a bit of a leap because we don't know what's going on truly in the background here. We don't find any more before or after this story about the centurion and his life. But we can assume that we know a few things about him. By virtue of the fact of his job description, we know that he was a Roman soldier. He was a guard, and he was given orders to be there at the crucifixion that day. He probably saw this as as bizarre as it sounds to us, probably a fairly routine thing. Hey, I've been told this is what I'm supposed to do today. I've been stationed to be at this hillside. I know that the 3 crosses are going up. There's 3 men who are charged as criminals. The one who's going to be hanging in the middle, I've heard some rumors about him, but the people have called for his crucifixion, and Pilate okayed it. And so we're going ahead with this, and it's not up to me to feel one way or another about this. I'm just doing my job. And so that's probably his perspective that day. Crucifixion was something that the Romans did fairly regularly. You've probably heard a great deal about this in the past. But this was something that was meant to be a show of force. This is meant to show everybody what happens when you step over or out of bounds outside where you are supposed to be socially. This is what happens to those who might stage an insurrection. This is what happens to those who go against community leaders, who go against religious leaders in this community. And this is what happens when you challenge Rome. And so, yes, it is a gruesome, awful way to die. And it was very much done for that reason, purposefully, to make an example out of anybody who would overstep. So Jesus finds himself there on the cross that day. And obviously his circumstances are much different. But for the centurion, he probably is not really knowing much of the backstory. We can't assume that he has been following Jesus, but he probably heard some of the local scuttlebutt around who this man is and what all the hype is about. But as he's watching that day, and as he's watching the nails driven into Jesus' ankles and into his wrists, as he sees the crown of thorn placed on his head, as he hears the crowds jeering and mocking him, as he sees a few of his followers and his mother crying at his side, as he sees Jesus' side pierced open, he's watching the horror that is taking place. But again, he's trying to compartmentalize it and saying, this is part of the job. It's an unpleasant part of the job, but I'm doing my duty. Until Jesus cries out these final words, and he breathes his last. His body goes limp, and he dies. And that's when the centurion, something happens. Something clicks within him. Was it the nature by which Jesus died? Was it the fact that Jesus never relented in doing what he said he was called to do? Was it that Jesus never begged for his life and said, I'll take it all back and just let me come down and have a second chance. I'll do anything Caesar wants. Put me before Pilate. I'll fall to his feet and bow to him. No, I'll follow whatever the religious leaders of the day tell me I should do. Just let me have a second chance. He doesn't do that. He goes to the cross and takes this torture and punishment. So maybe that was what did it. But my guess is that God was stirring something within the centurion's heart that day too. Because something in that critical moment caused him to have a deep personal empathy toward Jesus. And the centurion calls out, truly, this man was God's son. It's not the first time in Mark's gospel that we hear those words. There's a tradition in the Bible, and you probably know this if you've done a good deal of Bible reading and if you've been in worship, but God always seems to find the least likely person in the story to fulfill God's purposes. You've picked up on this, right? I mean, it's always the person that would not be the first choice in the disciple draft that Jesus picks. It is not the first person or the most likely person to share this message of hope that God selects in the Hebrew Bible. And yet here we have another example where in Mark's gospel we have heard this phrase, "This is my son," or "This is God's son," 2 other times. And you know who said it the first 2 times? God says it the first 2 times. The first one is in Jesus' baptism. He's at the Jordan River. John the Baptist is baptizing Jesus, and we hear that the heavens parted. And the sky opens up and light comes down and the Holy Spirit descends like a dove upon Jesus. And this voice calls out, "This is my son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased." God says, "This is my son." And then we fast forward a few years later and a few more chapters in Mark, and we get to the story of the Transfiguration. And Jesus is with a couple of his disciples on the mountaintop. And once again, the sky opens up and there's this voice calling down, and it sounds almost terrifying to those who witnessed it. And the voice says, "This is my son. Listen to him." God's laying claim on Jesus and Jesus' life as God's son. But the next time we hear it, right after Jesus takes his final breath, who is it that says these words? The Roman soldier, the least likely person at the cross to say these words, to utter the words that only God has said before. Now, it is not a believer, it's not a Jew, it's not even a citizen of Jerusalem who would be naturally there. It is an appointed soldier who is just doing his job, but something so profound has just happened in his life that he has had a change of heart. Listen, we never know how it will be that these change of hearts moments will begin or come about in our lives. But when we start to feel that tug on our hearts, it's important that we listen. It's important that we begin to open ourselves up to the possibilities that maybe God is trying to show us something different or new. And maybe it feels a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe it feels a little bit threatening even. And if we think about Jesus' ministry, man, that is what happened over and over again. Jesus is beginning to attract followers with his teachings, but then again, he locks horns with the traditional leaders of his day. Whenever he goes and teaches the Jesus way of interpreting the scriptures or the Jesus way of interpreting God's will, it seems to be in opposition to what everybody else has been taught. And some are hesitant to get on board and others jump right in. But everybody that begins to follow Jesus will eventually have a change of heart. And it begins to reshape everything for them. And that's why it's so important that we start to pay attention and close attention when these moments begin to creep into our lives. Because maybe God is trying to show us or tell us something that will significantly shape our lives differently going forward. My guess is that those moments that you have remembered as those change of heart moments, you would say have been exactly that. They felt scary. They felt like a risk. They felt like really taking a plunge into the deep end. And yet, what has happened since then is you have grown, you have expanded, you have matured as a person. And when it comes to matters of faith, it's just like muscle, right? You have to exercise that muscle. It's not as though we get to a certain place in our faith and then we plateau and we say, okay, we've learned it all. We've graduated from religious knowledge. We've graduated from Christian experience and theology, and we'll just ride it out from here. But think of what that would mean for your life. What if you had been taught everything by the time you were confirmed that you needed to know about the Christian faith, and your beliefs stayed the same as they did when you were, say, 14 years old? Is that the kind of Christian that you want to be? Well, of course not. And yet we get so concerned about things that feel like entering into new territory, or we feel like this is going to be this heretical leap, and there's no coming back from it. We get scared about what that looks like. But I would urge you to consider this. Your faith is not meant to be that fragile. Faith is supposed to be strong enough to explore questions, to enter into a conversation, to be challenged, to consider different perspectives and choose to accept them or reject them, but to consider them nonetheless and not be threatened by them all the same. And I'm thankful that what I know of this church is this is a community of believers who are not uncomfortable with the idea of having those kinds of conversations. You are okay with being stretched. And at the end of the day, you may not all arrive at the same conclusions, but you're not threatened by the presence of people who might think a little bit differently, do a little bit differently, believe a little bit differently, because we are the body of Christ in this together. Change of heart is a part of change. And when you think back on your life, maybe it's one of the most significant types of change you have ever experienced. And what I'd like you to carry away, not just from today, but from the past month of this sermon series on change, is remember these key things. That as people of faith, we can experience change with God as our partner on the journey or as our wrestling partner. We can experience the scriptures as the verses that inform and shape our lives, that talk about humanity's struggle and embrace of God throughout the millennia, and that the scriptures help inform us and realign us when we get off track. We can choose change rather than letting change call all of the shots. And when we do, we can bring others on board with us and have companions in this life. And today, that a change of heart, while often feeling like the most threatening of all the types of change we can consider, is sometimes the one that yields the greatest results and the greatest transformation in our own lives, even if it comes from a place of deep pain. Change in 2020 and beyond continues to sometimes bring forth the good and the bad. But as people of faith, it also sometimes means, perhaps more often than not, the blessing as well.